Miss Marple and the murmur across the fogbound fields. Hello dear friends, and welcome back to the comforting world of warm chapters. I'm Thomas, and I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. Please subscribe to the channel for more mysterious stories like this. Now settle in, make yourself comfortable, and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. Mist over Millbrook Meadow. Early November brought to St Mary Mead that peculiar kind of stillness which is not, strictly speaking, peace. It was a stillness with ears, a stillness that seemed to wait behind curtains, gather beneath hedges and pause at garden gates, as though the village itself had become aware of something approaching, long before any of its inhabitants had thought to give the matter a name. By the last week of October, the elms along the lane had shed their remaining leaves. They stood now in bare, patient rows, their dark branches drawn against skies that seldom lifted beyond a soft, woolly grey. The cottage gardens had surrendered their summer pretensions. Dahlias had been cut back, rose beds carefully mulched, and the borders tidied by hands that found comfort in order. St Mary Mead, as it always did at that time of year, had turned inward upon itself. Doors closed earlier, lamps were lit sooner, conversations lasted longer. The village found its amusements in sitting rooms, parlours and kitchens, where firelight made even the plainest room appear confidential. Tea trays were carried in. Coal settled in grates. Curtains were drawn with the faintly ceremonial air of shutting out not merely the dark, but whatever the dark might contain. It was precisely in such weather that the fog began. At first it came lightly, almost apologetically, drifting in thin pale ribbons from the direction of Millbrook Meadow. By dusk it would lie low over the farmland, threading itself between the hedges and across the narrow field paths. By midnight it had thickened. By dawn the barley fields and the ditch beyond the eastern edge of the village had vanished altogether, swallowed by a whiteness so complete that one might stand at a garden gate and see no farther than the first turning of the lane. The hawthorn hedges became black shapes without detail. The footpaths disappeared. The world contracted to a few known yards and a few guessed ones beyond. Such weather, as the older inhabitants of St Mary Mead were well aware, was very good for stories. It was on a Tuesday morning in the first week of November, and while the fog was still lifting reluctantly from the lane outside the village shop, that the first story made its appearance. Like most things of consequence in St Mary Mead, it arrived by way of ordinary conversation among people who had not the least intention of spreading gossip, though this naturally felt it only right that facts should be properly understood. A small but dependable gathering of ladies had assembled outside the shop, baskets over arms, scarves drawn close at the throat, each prepared to purchase something quite necessary and to learn, incidentally, everything that had happened since the previous afternoon. The story concerned Samuel Topp. Samuel Topp was a farm labourer of steady habits and uninteresting character, which, in a village, is often the highest possible recommendation. He had worked for various local farmers for the better part of 20 years, rising before dawn, walking where necessary, speaking when spoken to, and drinking no more than was sensible for a man who had to be awake in the dark. He was perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, slow in movement, and economical with words. He attended church every Sunday, not with visible enthusiasm, but with the regularity of a man who accepted certain duties as he accepted bad weather and hard ground. No one had ever accused Samuel Topp of imagination. That was what made the matter awkward. According to Samuel, he had been crossing Millbrook Meadow before dawn on Monday, taking the field path toward Robert Langley's farm when he heard his name, not shouted, not called loudly, whispered. A low, soft whisper somewhere in the fog. Samuel? He had stopped at once. That, he admitted. He had stood still with the damp air against his face and listened. There had been nothing to see. No lantern, no figure, no movement in the white thickness around him. He had turned one way and then the other, but the fog gave back only its own blankness. No second whisper came, no footstep followed, no voice explained itself. After several moments, Samuel Topp had walked on, rather more quickly than before. He said nothing about it during the day. It was only that evening, in the settled warmth of the public house, when 2 or 3 men were discussing the weather and the state of the paths, that something loosened his tongue. He mentioned it without flourish. He had heard his name in Millbrook Meadow, that was all. By Tuesday morning the story had travelled through Saint. Mary Mead, with admirable efficiency. The ladies outside the shop received it with that comfortable scepticism which allows for amusement without entirely excluding the possibility of terror. Mrs. Price, who kept the post office counter and possessed firm views on most subjects, said that Samuel had been half asleep and had heard his own breathing. Miss Hartley, who taught the younger children on Thursday afternoons and had a weakness for old legends, thought it rather romantic. Old country places, she said, often had such things about them. Mrs. Purvis, a practical woman who distrusted romance in all its forms, declared that damp air did strange things to sound, and that there was the end of it. Miss Jane Marple, who had paused in her careful progress along the lane and joined the little group outside the shop, had listened without interruption. She was a slender, upright, elderly lady, neatly dressed with white hair arranged simply beneath her hat, and mild blue eyes that gave an impression of innocence to those who did not know her well. Those who did know her well were less easily comforted by that mildness. Miss Marple's eyes noticed far too much. On this particular morning she wore a grey wool coat buttoned to the throat and carried a basket over one arm, although she had not yet entered the shop. She had the air of someone who had set out on a practical errand and had unexpectedly found something more useful than groceries. When the others had finished making their judgments, Miss Marple said very gently, "A whisper in open country is rather an unusual thing." The ladies looked at her. "In a room," Miss Marple continued, "oh, one whispers because one does not wish everyone to hear. But in a field, with no one about, it seems rather more particular. It suggests that the voice was meant for one person only." There was a brief pause. It was not a dramatic remark. Miss Marple very seldom made dramatic remarks. Yet it had the effect, as her remarks often did, of leaving everyone with the uncomfortable suspicion that something perfectly ordinary had just become less ordinary than before. Mrs. Price said that Samuel was probably still half asleep. Mrs. Purvis said again that fog-distorted sound. Miss Hartley looked faintly delighted. Then, since village conversation never remains long on one subject without acquiring another, the talk moved on to the price of coal, Mrs. Finch's rheumatism, and whether the vicar's niece was engaged or merely behaving as though she wished to be. The story might have faded there, becoming one of those little November curiosities, recalled only when the weather was suitably damp, had it not been for Mr. Arthur Selby. Arthur Selby was a man of about 60, recently retired from a long career as a land agent in the county. He had come to St. Mary Mead 18 months earlier, after the death of his elder brother, from whom he had inherited a modest but well-situated house on Driftwood Road, together with a garden rather larger than one man could easily maintain. He was lean, precise, and carefully dressed. His grey hair was smooth to one side. His speech was measured. His manner suggested a lifetime spent inspecting boundaries, assessing leases, and managing other people's property interests with quiet authority. He was not a man who made extravagant claims, nor did he seem inclined toward idle fears. Since his arrival in the village, Mr. Selby had done exactly what was required of a newcomer who wished eventually to cease being one. He had made himself useful without making himself conspicuous. He had joined the village hall committee, advised on questions of land and drainage when asked, and shown a tactful willingness to listen before offering an opinion. In St. Mary Mead, this was considered good breeding of the most practical sort. His wife, Mrs. Eleanor Selby, had also settled into village life with admirable competence. She was several years younger than her husband, composed, sensible, and brisk in her domestic arrangements. She did not invite confidences easily, but she could be trusted with them, which in St. Mary Mead was almost as valuable as warmth and considerably rarer. It was Mr. Selby who, having heard Samuel Topp's story discussed among the men at the village hall on Tuesday evening, announced his intention of going out to Millbrook Meadow to look at the place for himself. He made the statement in his usual straightforward manner. A field path, a drainage ditch, a report of a sound in poor visibility. These were matters, he implied, that might be examined rationally. Several of the men present took it as nothing more than the gesture of a former land agent who could not quite abandon the habits of his profession. There was nothing alarming in it. Millbrook Meadow was not private land in any meaningful sense. The path across it was a right-of-way of long standing. The ditch at the far end marked the boundary between two farms. Samuel Topp's whisper, if treated rationally, was almost certainly a trick of missed memory or tired nerves. Almost certainly. Miss Marple, when she heard of Mr. Selby's intention, said nothing for a little while. She was sitting that evening in her small parlour at Mead, her knitting resting in her lap, the curtains drawn against the damp dark outside. The gas fire murmured softly. On the small table beside her stood a cup of tea, untouched for longer than was usual. Miss Marple was thinking. She thought of Samuel Topp, who was not fanciful. She thought of a whisper that had used his name. She thought of the difference between a sound heard by chance and a sound intended to be heard. She thought of Mr. Arthur Selby, who knew land, boundaries, rights of way, drainage, our ownership, and the small practical secrets of fields. And she thought of Millbrook Meadow itself, lying low beyond the village, bordered by hawthorn and cut across by that old ditch where two farms met and old arrangements had long ago hardened into accepted fact. Outside, the mist was thickening again across the barley fields. The village was quiet in the way small English villages are quiet on November evenings. Not empty, never empty, merely gathered in. Each household sat behind its own square of lamplight. Each room contained its own warmth, its own worries, its own little hoard of knowledge. A motor car passed along the lane. Its headlamps briefly lit the fog in a pearly glare before turning the corner and disappearing. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and counted 3 stitches. Then she stopped again. A whisper had been heard. Now, a careful man had decided to go and inspect the place where it had been heard. That might mean nothing. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that when something odd happens in a village, and a sensible person decides to investigate it alone, the oddness does not always remain harmless. She laid her needles down and looked toward the curtained window. The November night pressed thickly against the glass. "I do hope," Miss Marple murmured to herself, "that Mr. Selby is not too determined." For she had known determined people before. They were often admirable. They were also at times remarkably easy to lead. Chapter 2. The Lantern Among the Barley Rows. The news reached Miss Marple before 8 o'clock on Wednesday morning. It came by way of Mrs. Pumphrey's youngest girl, who had been sent to the bakery and had gathered, arranged, and delivered the information with the solemn efficiency of a child entrusted by Providence with a disaster. She stood on Miss Marple's step, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright with importance. Mr. Selby from Driftwood Road had been found in the barley field. He was lying on the ground. Dr. Haydock had been sent for. Mrs. Selby was in a dreadful state. There had been a lantern. Everyone was saying he had tripped. Miss Marple thanked the child kindly, gave her a biscuit from the tin by the door, and went inside at once to put on her coat. The morning was cold and grey. The cloud hung low, offering no promise of brightness. The worst of the fog had retreated with the dawn, but it had not gone. It lingered in hollows, clung to hedges, and lay in pale strips across the lower fields, as though reluctant to abandon a secret it had kept through the night. Miss Marple walked at a measured pace, her basket over one arm more from habit than need. On the way she paused to exchange a few words with the coalman, who had already heard something of the matter and was visibly gratified to find that Miss Marple had heard it too. He had opinions. Most people had opinions before breakfast in St. Mary Mead, especially when misfortune had occurred within walking distance. By the time Miss Marple reached the edge of Millbrook Meadow, A small gathering had formed at the stile where the footpath crossed into the field. It consisted of those villagers who had heard the news early enough and possessed enough concern, curiosity or leisure to come and look without appearing to have come merely to look. They stood on the dry side of the hedge in a loose cluster, speaking in lowered voices. There is a particular tone people use near the scene of an accident. It is not quite respect and not quite excitement, but an uneasy mixture of both. The facts, once separated from embroidery, were these. Mr. Arthur Selby had been discovered about 2 hours earlier by Daniel Pike, a young farmhand employed by Robert Langley, whose fields bordered the eastern edge of the meadow. Pike came from a family that had worked local farms for 3 generations. He knew the land as one knows a familiar room in the dark. Every dip, every gate, every bad patch of ground after rain. He had been crossing the meadow on his way to work when he found Mr. Selby near the drainage ditch at the far end of the Barley rows. Mr. Selby was unconscious but breathing. There was an injury to the side of his head, apparently consistent with striking it against the earthen bank in a fall. A lantern stood a few feet away. Its wick was still burning with a small, patient flame. It was the lantern that interested Miss Marple. Not because it was strange that a man should take a lantern into a foggy field at night. That was perfectly reasonable. But because the lantern had been found standing. A man returning home carries his lantern. A man who has finished his business does not leave it burning in a barley field. A man who drops suddenly may let it fall. A man surprised may set it down. A man interrupted may forget it. A man who expects to need both hands may place it carefully beside him. There are many ways, Miss Marple reflected, in which a lantern might be left behind. Only some of them suggested an accident. Dr. Haydock had been called and had given the opinion that the injury was serious enough to cause concern, though not hopeless. Mr. Selby had been carried back to Driftwood Road on an improvised stretcher by Daniel Pike and young Tom Archer from the farm supply yard. He now lay unconscious in his own house under Mrs. Selby's anxious care. Inspector Slack of the County Constabulary had arrived by motor car shortly after 7. He had examined the scene, spoken with Daniel Pike, looked at the ditch and formed his conclusion. It was, he said, a straightforward accident. Mr. Selby had gone out in the fog with his lantern, lost his footing in poor visibility, and fallen against the bank. Such things happened every autumn, particularly to people who believed that practical experience exempted them from practical caution. Inspector Slack was a brisk man who preferred facts when they were tidy, and conclusions when they could be made to fit before lunch. He took several notes, gave several instructions, and departed with the air of a person who had put the matter in its proper place. Miss Marple was not so certain. She did not say so aloud. It was not her habit to contradict official conclusions in front of a hedge, particularly before she had heard what the village had to say. Official people were very useful, of course, but they did sometimes suffer from a weakness for the obvious explanation. In village life, Miss Marple had found, the obvious explanation was often merely the one most people wished to be true. So she stood quietly at the edge of the group and listened. Mrs. Purvis, who only the previous day had dismissed Samuel Topp's whisper as damp air and nothing more, was now inclined to connect it with Mr. Selby's fall. This, she said, proved what she had always felt, that November was an unlucky month. The Coleman's wife, who had joined them from the direction of the post office, said that her husband's cousin had once fallen into a drainage ditch in Dorset, and had never afterwards been quite right about east and west. This seemed to Miss Marple only distantly relevant, but it was received with the grave respect due to family evidence. At a little before 9, Miss Clara Finch arrived. She had heard the news on her way to the schoolhouse and stopped at the stile, looking genuinely distressed. Miss Finch was perhaps 38, the village school teacher, neat in dress and restrained in manner, with a fine-boned face and an expression of habitual attentiveness. She lived alone in a small cottage on Fenwick Road, and was known to walk the field path beside Millbrook Meadow most mornings, claiming that open air before a day of teaching helped to steady the mind. This morning, however, she did not look steady. "I cannot understand what possessed him to go into the meadow at night," she said. more to herself than to the others. Several people murmured agreement. "He mentioned the whisper to me," Miss Finch added. Miss Marple's eyes turned toward her. "On Monday," Miss Finch continued, "I passed him on the lane. He said he meant to see for himself whether the field had anything unusual about it. I told him Samuel Topp was the most level-headed man on the farms, and if Samuel said he heard something, then perhaps there was something to hear." She paused, looking out over the meadow. The fog had thinned now, and the far end of the field could just be seen as a blurred line of hedge and ditch. "He seemed quite determined," she said quietly. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands over the handle of her basket. Determined men, she thought, did not usually wander into foggy fields at night unless something had already arranged itself in their minds. They were not pushed by curiosity alone. They were answering something, a word, a suspicion, a memory, an invitation. But aloud she said only, "You were very kind to speak with him, Miss Finch, though I hope you won't take cold standing here, and the children will be waiting, will they not?" Miss Finch started slightly, as though recalled from a private thought. She agreed that she must go, gave one last worried glance toward Millbrook Meadow, and hurried on toward the schoolhouse. Miss Marple watched her until she turned into the lane. At a little after 9, Robert Langley appeared by the far gate of the farmyard. He was a broad, capable-looking man of about 50, square-jawed and weathered, with the solid look of a farmer who had spent most of his life outdoors and expected no sympathy for it. He had farmed the land bordering Millbrook Meadow for 15 years, having taken it over from his father. He knew every ditch, hedge, gate, and uneven patch of ground with the intimacy that comes not from ownership alone, but from long use. He had already spoken with Inspector Slack before the inspector left. Yes, he had checked his fields late the previous evening, as he sometimes did when weather was coming in. No, he had seen nothing unusual. Yes, the ditch was a known hazard in poor visibility. Yes, he had been meaning to put some marker near that end of the path for some time. He said all this plainly and practically. Inspector Slack, who responded well to plain and practical men, had found it satisfactory. Miss Marple watched Robert Langley as he spoke to one or two of the villagers by the gate. There was nothing obviously wrong in his manner. He was calm, cooperative, respectably concerned. Indeed, he was precisely what one would expect a sensible farmer to be when an accident had occurred near his land. And yet, Miss Marple had long ago learned to be cautious of that small phrase, and yet, it had led her, over the years, through many locked rooms, many respectable silences, and many statements that were perfectly true, except in the one particular where truth mattered. Robert Langley's calmness was not theatrical. It was not false in any obvious way. But Miss Marple found herself remembering something a retired solicitor named Mr. Hartington had once said to her. There was, he had observed, a particular kind of calm a man acquired when he had already decided what his position was to be and meant to maintain it. It was not quite the same thing as natural composure. It resembled it very closely, just as a prepared speech resembles ordinary conversation when the preparation has been done well. Miss Marple did not accuse Robert Langley of anything. She merely remembered Mr. Hartington. After a little while, the villagers began to drift away. The cold had entered their shoes. There were households to attend to, errands to finish, fires to mend, children to teach, and meals to prepare. Misfortune, however interesting, could not be allowed to interrupt the entire machinery of village life. Miss Marple walked slowly back along the lane toward her own gate. The fog had lifted further now, but the morning remained colourless. Water clung to the hedges. A rook called somewhere beyond the elms. The village had resumed its usual appearance, but not quite its usual feeling. News had entered it. News changes a village. It settles in corners and waits for people to add to it. At her gate, Miss Marple stopped and looked back in the direction of Millbrook Meadow, though she could no longer see it from where she stood. Mr. Selby lay unconscious in his house on Driftwood Road. Mrs. Selby was frightened. Samuel Topp had heard his name whispered in the fog. Clara Finch had warned Mr. Selby that Samuel was not fanciful. Robert Langley had seen nothing unusual. Inspector Slack believed it was an accident. And in the barley field, a lantern had burned steadily through the last hours of darkness, standing a few feet away from a fallen man. Miss Marple opened her gate and went inside. She would call upon Mrs. Selby that afternoon. It was the neighbourly thing to do. One brought sympathy, practical assistance, perhaps a jar of soup or a little cake. One asked after the invalid. One sat for a few minutes and listened. Listening, Miss Marple had often thought, was among the most underestimated arts in England. She put the kettle on and stood for a moment at the kitchen window, looking out over the grey November garden. The bare stems of the roses were dark with damp. The sky beyond the elms was pale and low. Not the fog, she thought, not the ditch, not even the fall, the lantern. That was the thing that would not settle. A lantern still burning at 7 o'clock in the morning was not merely an object left behind, it was a sentence unfinished. Miss Marple made her tea, sat down at the kitchen table, and thought about it for a very long time. Chapter 3. A Handkerchief. Hidden under the Hawthorn hedge. Miss Marple allowed the morning to pass before setting out for Driftwood Road. There were practical reasons for this, and Miss Marple had always believed that practical reasons, properly understood, were often the servants of intuition. Dr. Haydock would require time to make his second call, to examine Mr. Selby again, and to deliver his more considered opinion without finding unnecessary visitors in the way. Mrs. Selby would require time also, time to absorb the shock of the morning, time to speak to the doctor, time to make whatever telephone calls were necessary, time, above all, to pass from the first sharp confusion of alarm into that composed exhaustion which so often follows the opening hours of a domestic crisis. It was then, Miss Marple knew, that a quiet and sympathetic visitor might be most acceptable. Until then she occupied herself usefully. She wrote 2 letters, repotted the sweet peas that had been overwintering on the kitchen windowsill and had grown more leggy than she liked, and read several pages from a volume on the history of English enclosure law, which she had borrowed from the Mobile Library some weeks earlier and had not yet found a reason to return. This morning she found enclosure law rather more interesting than she had upon first acquaintance. Old boundaries, ancient rights, ditches that had once meant more than ditches, hedgerows planted where agreements had ended and quarrels had begun. Such matters, she reflected, were apt to sleep for a very long time, and then wake abruptly. She set out at 2 o'clock, carrying a small pot of bramble jelly made from September's first picking. It had been waiting in her pantry for an occasion that deserved it. Illness, distress, and uncertainty were all suitable occasions for bramble jelly, especially when brought without fuss. The house on Driftwood Road was a pleasant, the unpretentious red brick building with a wide front garden that had clearly been designed with more ambition than November allowed it to display. The beds were bare now, the shrubs dark with damp, and the lawn dulled by cold, but the gate was freshly painted and the path had been swept. These, Miss Marple observed, were the signs of a household that maintained its standards by habit rather than for show. Mrs. Eleanor Selby answered the door herself. That, too, told Miss Marple something. It suggested that Mrs. Selby had not wished anyone to remain close enough to answer it for her, but had been sensible enough to expect that someone would call. She was a tall woman, trimly built, with dark hair touched at the temples with grey, and a face handsome in a quiet, determined fashion. She wore a dark skirt and a cream blouse. Miss Marple noticed, with the particular sympathy of one who had endured difficult mornings herself, that Mrs. Selby had clearly taken pains with her appearance before coming to the door. It was a small act of self-command. Small acts of self-command often revealed far more than declarations. Mrs. Selby received Miss Marple and the bramble jelly with equal measures of warmth and restraint, showed her into the sitting-room, and went to make tea with the air of a woman, grateful for an occupation that involved cups, saucers, and a definite sequence of actions. Miss Marple sat in the chair offered to her, and looked quietly about while she waited. It was a room that had accumulated the evidence of Arthur Selby's professional life. There were shelves of reference volumes arranged in orderly rows: estate management, land tenure, drainage, local history, agricultural valuations. In one corner stood a desk, not cluttered, but full. Papers sorted into neat stacks, envelopes aligned, a ruler placed precisely beside a blotter. On the walls hung one or two framed maps of the district, not decorative landscapes, but working maps. The kind a man looks at when he wishes to understand where one thing ends and another begins. Arthur Selby had been a man who understood land. The room said so more clearly than any introduction could have done. Mrs. Selby returned with the tea tray and sat down with the composed efficiency of a woman who had decided that composure was the only useful contribution she could make to the present situation. "Dr. Haydock has been again," she said, pouring with a steady hand. "He is satisfied that Arthur will recover fully. The head wound is uncomfortable rather than dangerous. He may wake later this afternoon." "That is very good news," Miss Marple said sincerely. "Yes." Mrs. Selby set down the teapot and looked for a moment toward the window. Beyond it, the November garden stood bare and orderly under a pewter sky. "I confess I'm still entirely at a loss to understand what took him out there. He said nothing to me about going." "He had mentioned to others that he intended to look at the meadow," Miss Marple said gently. "He mentioned it to me as well, but I assumed he meant in daylight." There was a thread in Mrs. Selby's voice then. Not exactly anger, not quite distress. It was the feeling one hears in sensible people when another sensible person has behaved in a manner that cannot be made to fit. Arthur is not, as a rule, impulsive. He considers things before he acts. That is what made his career what it was. Miss Marple nodded, accepted her tea and said nothing for a little while. Silence, when kindly offered, is often an invitation. Mrs. Selby accepted it. She said that she had woken at 6 and found her husband's side of the bed empty. That had not alarmed her at first. Arthur sometimes rose early. But when she came downstairs and found no sign of him, uneasiness had begun to take shape. She had looked into the garden and called his name. There had been no answer. Then she had put on her coat over her nightgown and gone as far as the lane, where she met the Coleman. He told her that something had happened at Millbrook Meadow. "And then," Mrs. Selby said, "I knew." She described it with admirable brevity, as if the distress itself were less important than the facts through which it had moved. "I went out to the field. I ought not to have done, perhaps. Dr. Haydock had already been called, and there was nothing practical I could contribute, but I went." "Of course you did," Miss Marple said warmly. "It was still foggy near the hedge." Mrs. Selby set her cup down with careful precision. "I crossed the stile and went along the field path as far as the Hawthorn hedge on the eastern side where the path turns. I could see the men farther along with Dr. Haydock. I called out that I was coming, and one of them told me to wait where I was for a moment. So I did." She paused. Miss Marple waited. "It was while I was standing there, at the turn of the path by the Hawthorn hedge, that the constable noticed something at the base of the hedge. He pointed it out to me and asked whether I recognised it." Mrs. Selby looked directly at Miss Marple. "It was Arthur's handkerchief." Miss Marple did not move. "His initials are on all of them. A.R.S. He was particular about such things. There was no question." "And the handkerchief was beneath the hedge itself?" Miss Marple asked. "Pushed in or caught at the base of it, wet through with fog." Miss Marple received this information inwardly and placed it very carefully beside the lantern. A handkerchief dropped on a path is one thing. A handkerchief pushed or caught beneath a hawthorn hedge at the turn of a field path is quite another. Such a thing does not arrive there by ordinary carelessness. It suggests contact, a hand stretched out, a stumble, a struggle, a deliberate concealment, or perhaps the involuntary gesture of a man who had paused at that very point and gripped what was in his hand more tightly than he knew. "What did the constable make of it?" Miss Marple asked. He appeared to think Arthur must have taken it out and dropped it without noticing. Mrs. Selby's tone was perfectly controlled. It also made quite plain what she thought of this explanation. "You do not think that is likely? Arthur does not drop things without noticing." She said it simply, not as an act of loyalty but as a statement of evidence. "In 31 years I've not known him to leave so much as an umbrella behind in a restaurant. He is meticulous. It was one of the qualities that made him reliable in his work." Miss Marple thought of the orderly shelves in the room, the precise maps on the walls, the papers arranged on the desk. She thought of the book on enclosure law still lying on her own kitchen table, a man whose life had been spent upon boundaries, agreements, measurements, and small decisive details did not wander into a field at night, drop a handkerchief beneath a hedge, and fail to notice it. At least not under ordinary circumstances. She thought too of a retired schoolmaster she'd once known, a nervous but disciplined man who had told her that whenever he was agitated he would press some small object in his hand, a coin, a key, a folded piece of cloth, because the sensation of holding something steady helped him to hold himself steady. Such little habits, Miss Marple knew, could live for years almost invisibly. A wife might not notice them, a friend might never see them, yet under pressure, they might reveal themselves in some small object found where it ought not to be. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, in the tone of one thinking aloud rather than drawing a conclusion, "whether Mr. Selby may have stopped at the Hawthorn hedge before reaching the drainage ditch." Mrs. Selby looked at her steadily. Whether the hedge itself was a landmark of some importance to him that evening. "What sort of importance?" "I am not at all sure," Miss Marple said honestly. "I merely think that a careful man, in an unfamiliar meadow at night, in fog carrying a lantern, would very likely take his bearings as he went. The hedge marks the turning of the path. It is a fixed point." Mrs. Selby was silent for a moment. "You think he stopped there deliberately?" "I think it is possible that he paused there." Yes. "And that he was not alone when he did so." It was not quite a question. Miss Marple did not treat it as one. She lifted her teacup and remarked that the bramble jelly came from the first picking of the season, which she had always found superior to the later gatherings, and that she hoped Mr. Selby would be well enough to enjoy it when his appetite returned. Mrs. Selby accepted this gentle deflection with the intelligence of a woman who understood when something had been said as plainly as it was going to be said. For another quarter of an hour they spoke of other things, comfortable things, necessary things, the garden, sweet peas, the difficulty of keeping a good fire in damp weather. November, they agreed, was trying, though it possessed its own kind of beauty if one were disposed to look for it in the right places. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Selby accompanied her to the door. She held it for a moment before opening it. "Miss Marple," she said, with a directness that suggested the sentence had been waiting in her for some time, "if you think Arthur did not simply fall, I should rather know it than not." Miss Marple looked at her with the steady kindness she reserved for moments when evasion would be a cruelty. "I think," she said carefully, "that your husband is a very precise man who went into that field with a purpose. And I think that whatever happened there was not entirely of his own making." Mrs. Selby did not flinch. "Beyond that," Miss Marple added, "I should not like to say anything further until I have thought a little more." Mrs. Selby nodded once, as though this were not a comforting answer, but an honest one, and therefore preferable. Miss Marple stepped out into the cold afternoon. The sky had deepened to a uniform pewter. The lane was quiet, with that hush peculiar to November afternoons, when the day seems to fade before it has properly begun. She walked slowly, basket over her arm, turning the handkerchief over and over in her mind. Arthur Selby's handkerchief. A.R.S. Wet through with fog. Pushed or caught beneath the hawthorn hedge. Careful men do not drop things carelessly, and men investigating things that have unsettled them do not usually put handkerchiefs under hedges unless something has caused them to do so. At the corner of the lane, Miss Marple turned toward home, and the pale November light closed quietly around her. Chapter 4. Flattened Barley in the Field. Thursday brought a dry morning, which was something of a relief after the accumulated dampness of the week. The fog had not returned the previous evening. In its place came a sharp, clear cold that stiffened the grass at first light and sealed the puddles along the lane with a thin glaze of ice by 7 o'clock. The sky was pale winter blue, a colour that promised no warmth but at least had the honesty not to pretend otherwise. Along the field edge, the bare trees stood unusually distinct, every branch and twig etched against the air. Miss Marple had slept tolerably well. She regarded this as a useful sign. Her mind, she knew, often worked most effectively when not directly summoned. If given sufficient material, it would arrange and rearrange facts quietly in the background while she slept, rather as a careful housemaid might set a room to rights before anyone came downstairs. She rose at her usual hour, attended to breakfast and correspondence, and was at her garden gate by 9 o'clock. Her stated intention was to walk as far as the post office. Her unstated intention was to walk rather farther if circumstances made it useful. Circumstances, as they often did in St. Mary Mead, presented themselves before she had gone 100 yards. She met Miss Clara Finch returning along the lane from the direction of Millbrook Meadow. The schoolteacher was a little later than usual, she explained, because the frost had made the stile slippery and required more cautious negotiation. She wore a brown wool coat and stout shoes, and she carried no bag. Miss Marple had noticed before that Miss Finch carried nothing on these morning walks. No basket, no book, no umbrella unless rain was certain. It was as though she preferred to move unencumbered, with both hands free and nothing that might hinder her pace. There was a self-sufficiency about her. Miss Marple found it admirable. She also found it interesting. The two women fell into step along the lane with the natural ease of people whose routes happen to coincide and whose acquaintance is comfortable enough to require no performance. "I have been to the meadow again this morning," Miss Finch said after a short stretch of companionable quiet. She said it without apology, as a simple statement of fact. "Were you the only one there?" Miss Marple asked. "There was a constable at the stile when I arrived. He left after a few minutes. I believe the official view is that there is nothing further to examine." A pause. "I am not entirely sure the official view is correct." "Oh?" said Miss Marple, in the mild tone of someone very willing to hear more. Miss Finch was silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Not, Miss Marple thought, because she wished to conceal anything, but because she wished to be exact. Accuracy was a moral quality in some people. Miss Finch, she suspected, was one of them. "I walk that path almost every morning," Miss Finch said at last. "I know the field rather well, not as a farmer knows it, of course, but well enough to notice when something is different." She glanced at Miss Marple. "There is a patch of barley close to the drainage ditch, on the near side of it, where the stalks have been bent down." "Bent down?" Miss Marple repeated. "Not trampled carelessly. The way they are when someone cuts across a field without paying attention. Pressed flat. Quite deliberately, it seemed to me, as though someone had stood in one place for an extended period." Miss Marple walked on for several steps before speaking. "How large a patch?" "Perhaps 3 feet across, no more, but thoroughly flattened." "Near the ditch?" "Near, but not at the edge of it. A yard or so back from the bank. Close enough to watch anyone approaching along the path from the direction of the hedge, but not so close as to be obvious from the far end of the field." Miss Marple received this with inward satisfaction. The lantern had found a companion. The handkerchief had acquired a neighbour. Now there was flattened barley, and not anywhere, but in a position from which a person might wait unseen and observe another approaching. She did not show her satisfaction. It would not have been useful, and it might have alarmed Miss Finch into saying less rather than more. "I suppose the constable saw the flattened barley and noted it," she said instead. Miss Finch looked doubtful. "He was standing some distance away on the path when I arrived. I do not believe he went into the barley rows at all." This did not surprise Miss Marple. A constable assigned to guard the scene of an accident already pronounced accidental by Inspector Slack was not likely to feel a powerful urge to search a barley field for evidence of nothing in particular. He would do what was required, stand at the stile, discourage villagers from wandering, and avoid creating unnecessary complications. Miss Marple was about to make some gentle, non-committal reply when she perceived that Miss Finch had more to say. The schoolteacher was working toward it with the quiet determination of someone who's been thinking since dawn, and has decided at last to trust her conclusion to another person. "I suggested to the constable," Miss Finch said, "that someone might have stood in that spot for some time before Mr. Selby arrived, that it might have been the place from which the whisper was made, if one were to put any weight on Samuel Topp's account." And what did the constable say to that? He said it was more likely that Mr. Selby himself had stood there, listening for the whisper, since that was presumably why he'd gone to the field. She paused. He seemed to find that entirely satisfactory. "It is a possible explanation," Miss Marple said fairly. "But not the only one." "No," said Miss Marple, "not the only one." They had reached the corner where the lane divided, one branch turning toward the post office and the other toward the school. They stopped naturally, as people do at such junctions, held for a moment by the meeting of directions. The sunlight was thin and cold. Frost still edged the grass by the ditch. Somewhere nearby a gate creaked softly in the wind. "One usually stands still to listen," Miss Marple said, in a reflective tone. "One turns the head perhaps, one waits. But the body does not press the ground flat in the manner you describe simply by standing quietly for a few minutes." She looked at Miss Finch with a calm directness she allowed herself when speaking to someone whose intelligence she had judged sound. That degree of compression suggests something more sustained, a prolonged wait, or a prolonged conversation. Miss Finch met her gaze. "Not to argue," she said softly, as though testing the words. "I beg your pardon." "It was something I thought of standing there this morning looking at the stalks. People shift their weight when they are arguing. Even if their voices are quiet, their feet are restless." She frowned slightly, as though not entirely satisfied with her own phrasing. Miss Marple, however, understood her perfectly. She stood for a moment looking past Miss Finch toward the cold, pale sky above the elm trees. Something within her mind moved into place with a small, decisive click. Not merely waiting, not merely listening. A meeting, perhaps, a disagreement, perhaps, and if so, Mr. Selby had not walked blindly into misfortune. He had walked into an appointment. Miss Marple did not pursue the thought aloud. There are facts that become less useful when spoken too soon. A half-formed suspicion released into the air has a way of reaching exactly the ears it ought not to reach, and people, once warned that their explanations are being examined, generally improve them. Instead, Miss Marple asked whether Miss Finch had known Mr. Selby at all before the accident. Miss Finch said that she had spoken with him on the lane several times. She had found him thoughtful, courteous, and genuinely knowledgeable about land. It had always seemed to her a pity, she added, when people with real expertise retired early enough to find that expertise somewhat at loose ends. He'd been consulting some documents, she said. Then she stopped, as if the sentence had arrived somewhere before she intended it to. "Documents relating to the local farmland?" Miss Marple asked, with the most natural interest in the world. "I believe so. He mentioned it only briefly when we spoke on Monday. He said he had been looking at some old survey records in connection with a question that had come to his attention, and that he expected to have a clearer view of the matter within the week." Miss Finch hesitated. He seemed pleased about it. In the quiet way methodical people are pleased when they have found what they have been looking for. "Quite," said Miss Marple. The word was gentle, but her mind was no longer at the lane corner. It had gone to maps, boundaries, survey records, drainage ditches, rights of way, and a retired land agent who had entered a foggy meadow at night after announcing his intention to inspect it. She thanked Miss Finch warmly for her company, and the two women parted. Miss Finch toward the school, Miss Marple toward the post office. But the post office was now only the outward shape of her errand. Her thoughts moved in their own orderly fashion. Barley stalks pressed flat beside a drainage ditch, a handkerchief caught beneath a hawthorn hedge, a lantern left burning through the night, a careful man with old survey records and the satisfaction of a conclusion almost reached. And somewhere behind it all, a whisper in the fog that had called Samuel Topp's name, or perhaps had been meant to set another pair of ears listening. Miss Marple collected her letters at the post office and declined, with tactful regret, Mrs. Price's invitation to hear the latest report concerning Mrs. Price's daughter-in-law, whose domestic arrangements were apparently in a state of some disorder. She walked home through the cold, bright morning, carrying her basket and her thoughts with equal care. The barley stalks, she reflected, had not been pressed flat by a man listening in the dark for a disembodied whisper. They had been pressed flat by someone who had come prepared to remain there until another person arrived. And that, Miss Marple thought as she turned in at her own gate, was a very different thing indeed. Chapter 5. The Scarf, Snared in the Thorns. Friday morning came to St. Mary Mead, wrapped in a grey stillness that was neither fog nor clarity, but something suspended rather uneasily between the two. It was as though the weather had not yet decided what sort of day it meant to become, and had chosen to wait until the mid-morning before committing itself to any definite opinion. The frost of the previous day had softened in the night. The lane was damp again, the puddles freed from their thin skin of ice, and the air held that particular autumnal smell of wet earth, old leaves, and hedges beginning to darken into winter. It was not an unpleasant smell, provided one was warmly dressed and had somewhere purposeful to go. Miss Marple had somewhere purposeful to go. She had spent Thursday evening with her knitting in her lap, and her thoughts moving steadily beneath it. This, she had long ago discovered, was one of the most productive arrangements available to the human mind. Knitting occupied the surface of her attention just enough to prevent that restless and unhelpful circling that comes when one sits perfectly idle. At the same time, it left the deeper currents of thought free to proceed at their own pace. By bedtime, several rows of a grey wool cardigan had been completed. Several strands of understanding had also been drawn forward, not as yet far enough to be tied. It was the scarf that occupied her most. Mrs. Selby had not mentioned a scarf. That omission in itself was worth considering. Miss Marple had spent nearly an hour with Eleanor Selby on Wednesday afternoon, and Mrs. Selby was not a woman who omitted important details through carelessness. She had described the morning carefully, waking, finding Arthur's side of the bed empty, going downstairs, calling into the garden, meeting the Coleman in the lane, hurrying toward Millbrook Meadow, being stopped near the Hawthorn hedge while the doctor and the men attended to her husband. She had mentioned the handkerchief. She had not mentioned the scarf. Yet the scarf existed. Miss Marple had heard of it from Mrs. Purvis, who had heard it from the constable, who had apparently mentioned it in passing at the post office on Thursday morning. Such was the accepted chain by which information travelled in St. Mary Mead, irregular, indirect, but often surprisingly accurate when properly untangled. A wool scarf had been found caught on the thorns of the Hawthorn hedge, near the turn of the path. Mrs. Selby had been asked about it, and had said that it was hers. She supposed apparently that she must have caught and dropped it during the confusion on Wednesday morning, when she had been standing by the hedge while the men were with her husband. The constable had found this explanation sufficient. Miss Marple did not. She intended to look at the hedge for herself. She reached the field path at 20 minutes past 10, having paused on the way to speak to Samuel Topp, who was trimming the verge along the lane with a billhook. Samuel received her good morning with the solid equanimity of a man whose expression was not easily altered by social circumstance. Miss Marple had spoken with him once since Wednesday morning, outside the churchyard the previous afternoon. From that conversation, she had formed the view that Samuel Topp possessed a rare and valuable quality, reliable accuracy, not intelligence in the showy sense, not imagination, not quickness, something better for Miss Marple's present purpose. He reported what he had seen. He did not report what he had not seen. Such people were not common. When asked whether the whisper had seemed to come from any particular direction, Samuel had thought for a moment with the slow seriousness of a man who took questions exactly as they were given. "Far end of the meadow," he had said at last. "Toward the ditch side. Not loud exactly. Clear. That's not the same thing, I reckon." Miss Marple had agreed that it was very much not the same thing. Now, as she crossed the stile into Millbrook Meadow, that answer returned to her. Not loud, clear. There are voices that travel by accident and voices that are made to travel. The stile was dry enough to manage without difficulty. Miss Marple crossed carefully and walked along the path at a comfortable pace, looking about her with the interested, unhurried attention of someone who could not pass through a stretch of countryside without observing it. The barley row stood pale and still beneath the flat morning light. The ground was soft underfoot, but not unpleasant. A thrush was busy in the far hedge, turning over the damp leaves with brisk industry, and for a while its small practical sounds were the only sounds of consequence in the field. Miss Marple reached the hawthorn hedge at the turn of the path and stopped. It was an old hedge. Very old, she thought. Thickened at the base by decades of growth, weather, cutting, and winter dieback, until its lower branches had formed a dense and almost impenetrable tangle. It was thorny throughout, as hawthorn hedges are inclined to be, but particularly so near the ground, where the older wood had twisted inward upon itself into tight, near hard knots. It was the kind of hedge that caught things and kept them. Anyone who had ever pushed through such a boundary in the dark would know that well enough. Scraps of wool from passing sheep, wisps of dried grass carried by the wind, a torn thread from a sleeve, the loose end of a scarf. Miss Marple examined it with the calm, methodical attention she brought to physical evidence. To her there was no real difference between a hedge, a teacup, a tone of voice, or a missing handkerchief. All of them might tell the truth if only one looked at them properly. The relevant part of the hedge lay nearest the turn of the path. The thorns there were not, she noted, placed conveniently for a casual accident. They curved inward and backward as hawthorn thorns often do, excellent at retaining anything drawn against them, less likely to catch a passing garment unless that garment passed very close indeed. The path at that point was perhaps 4 feet wide. A person walking along it with ordinary care would not brush the hedge at all. A person standing pressed against the hedge in the dark, however, might very easily do so. Miss Marple stood there a little longer. She looked at the narrow space between the path and the hedge, then at the tangle of thorns, then along the line of sight toward the far end of the field, where the drainage ditch lay beyond the barley rows. Even on a dull morning the view was clear enough. The ditch could be seen. The boundary stone beyond it could be seen. A lantern burning in the darkness at the far end of the field would most certainly have been visible from this very place. Miss Marple considered that. A person standing at the hedge could watch the field. A person standing close enough to the hedge to catch a scarf could remain partly concealed. A person standing there in fog might hear without being heard, see a light before being seen, and wait for someone approaching from the direction of the village. That was not the position of someone who had wandered. It was the position of someone who had chosen. She turned at last and walked back along the field path toward the stile, her basket over her arm, her expression thoughtful. Not puzzled, precisely. Rather, the expression of one who has confirmed something already suspected, and now faces the more difficult task of deciding what it means. She was halfway along the lane toward home when she encountered Mrs. Selby coming from the opposite direction. Mrs. Selby carried a covered dish, and her face had the composed but slightly drawn appearance of a woman who had not slept as well as she would have liked, and was determined that no one should make unnecessary remarks about it. She stopped when she saw Miss Marple, and something in her posture suggested that the meeting was not unwelcome. "Arthur is awake," she said, before Miss Marple could speak. "He came round properly yesterday evening. He is not yet strong enough to say a great deal, but he is himself." "That is wonderful news," Miss Marple said, and meant it. "He asked for his papers." A faint expression crossed Mrs. Selby's face. Tolerant exasperation softened almost at once by affection. "I told him his papers would keep." They stood together in the lane for a moment. Mrs. Selby's eyes moved to the basket on Miss Marple's arm, then to the direction from which she had come. She was far too intelligent not to understand. "You've been to the field," she said. "I had not seen it properly in daylight," Miss Marple replied. This was perfectly true. Mrs. Selby was silent. She adjusted her grip on the covered dish, which appeared to contain soup, and looked down the lane with the expression of someone deciding how much truth to say aloud. Then she came to a decision. "The scarf the constable found," she said. "It is mine." Miss Marple waited. "I confirmed it because it is mine, and I saw no reason not to confirm it. But I did not drop it on Wednesday morning. I was not wearing it on Wednesday morning." She paused. "I wore it on Tuesday evening. I was restless after supper and went out for a short walk before Arthur left. I must have lost it then." Miss Marple looked at her with steady, kind attention. "I did not think it necessary to say all that to the constable," Mrs. Selby continued, with the faint crispness of a woman who had defended this decision to herself more than once and was still not wholly at ease with it. "It did not seem relevant. I went no farther than the lane. I certainly did not go into the field." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I did not suppose you had." Mrs. Selby met her eyes. "But if the scarf was on the hawthorn hedge, then it was carried there from the lane, and I cannot see how it came to be on that hedge, unless someone took it from where I had dropped it and brought it into the field." She said this with the flat precision of a person who has already followed the logic to its end and found the end deeply unpleasant. "Which means," she added, "someone was on the lane on Tuesday evening and was also in the field that night." Miss Marple thought of the scarf, damp with night mist, caught on the thorns, accepted too easily as an accidental loss. Not damp merely from Wednesday morning, damp because it had spent the night outside. She thought of the thorns that held what they caught. She thought of someone pressed against that hedge in the dark, watching across the field, waiting in the cold, perhaps with Mrs. Selby's scarf about their neck or in their hand. A person who had acquired it from the lane, a person who had either lost it by accident while concealed there, or placed it where it might later be found and misunderstood. The first possibility suggested carelessness. The second suggested calculation. And Miss Marple was not yet prepared to choose between them. She said none of this to Mrs. Selby. Mrs. Selby had already reached the portion of truth available to her, and there are times when to push a distressed person further is neither useful nor kind. "You were quite right to confirm that it was yours," Miss Marple said warmly. "That was the honest thing, and honesty in the end is always useful, even when it is inconvenient." Mrs. Selby looked at her for a moment with the careful gaze of a woman measuring whether she had been understood. Apparently she decided that she had. They parted at the corner, Mrs. Selby continuing toward Driftwood Road with her soup and her composed, watchful thoughts. Miss Marple turned toward her own gate with a great deal to add to everything she had already collected. The scarf had been there all night. Yeah, that now seemed certain. Which meant that whoever had stood against the hawthorn hedge, looking out across the field through darkness and fog, had been there before Arthur Selby arrived, had waited there long enough for the night mist to sink deep into the wool, and that, Miss Marple reflected, was a very long time to wait in the cold for something one had not arranged in advance. Chapter 6. The Farm Cart's Lantern Hook. Saturday was market day in Chipping Arden, the nearby town, and by 9 o'clock several of St. Mary Mead's more energetic residents had already departed by motor car or bus. The lanes were left to those who preferred the quieter pleasures of a Saturday morning at home. The greengrocer's had its usual small queue of housewives. The post office was briefly busy and then not. By 10:30, Tim Sixcents. A thin winter sunshine had appeared, offering light without warmth, rather like a host who opens the door but has not yet thought to light the fire. Miss Marple spent the early part of the morning writing to her nephew Raymond, who lived in London and wrote novels of the modern kind. Miss Marple read them with patient interest and did not always understand them, though she believed Raymond had talent and said so whenever an opportunity arose. It was true, and people who produced things, whether novels, plum jam or parish bazaars, benefited from encouragement now and then. After finishing the letter, she opened the small notebook she kept in the desk in her sitting room. In her neat, small handwriting, she had recorded the details of the Selby affair as they had accumulated through the week. Samuel Topp's whisper, or Arthur Selby's midnight visit to the meadow, the lantern left burning, the handkerchief under the hawthorn hedge, the flattened barley near the ditch, Mrs. Selby's scarf caught on the thorns, old survey records, Robert Langley's calmness. Looked at in isolation, each detail might be made to seem innocent. Placed in sequence, they began to resemble a pattern. Miss Marple studied the page as one might study a row of stitches to see whether the design was emerging correctly. She felt with quiet conviction that the shape of the matter was becoming clearer. What she required now was not necessarily more detail, but the proper setting of the details she already possessed. At 11 o'clock she set out for Langley's farm. She had been there once before, some months earlier, as part of a small parish committee considering whether the footpath through Millbrook Meadow required resurfacing. The question had eventually been resolved in the negative after much discussion and very little practical alteration, which was not uncommon in parish matters. She remembered the farmyard as a place of work and order. The buildings had been in good repair, the yard well maintained, the general impression that of a farm which took its responsibilities seriously without making any display of virtue. On that earlier occasion, she had formed a moderately favourable impression of Robert Langley. He had seemed capable, direct, and unsentimental. A man who knew what he thought and said it without decorating it unnecessarily. Miss Marple generally respected such people, even when what they thought and said was not exactly what one wished to hear. The farm cart stood in the yard when she arrived. It had been drawn up beside the barn wall in the manner of a vehicle recently used and returned to place, though not entirely put away. It was a solid, weathered thing, its boards silvered by rain and age, its ironwork beginning to show rust along the lower edges, but clearly still sound and well cared for. Fixed to its near side, just below the level of the driver's seat, was a lantern hook. A simple curved iron bracket, bolted securely to the wood, designed to hold a lantern during night work so that both hands might remain free. Miss Marple observed the hook with the attentive interest of a person who had come to see a particular thing and meant to see it properly. The metal was dark with age and honest use, or as one would expect. But along the upper curve of the bracket, where the iron was smoothest and where the base of a lantern would rest when set into place, there was a faint smear. Not rust, not old mud, something paler than rust and darker than dried dust. Fresh field soil, recently disturbed soil, soil that had not yet dried to its ordinary colour. Miss Marple leaned a little closer, not touching it. The smear was slight, very slight. It might easily have passed unnoticed by anyone not already thinking of lanterns, wet ground, and the far end of Millbrook Meadow. She was examining this detail when Robert Langley came out of the barn. He moved with the unhurried directness of a man completely at home in his own yard, as well he might, having spent the better part of 50 years in and around it. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, working trousers, and boots that suggested he had never considered mud a personal inconvenience. He saw Miss Marple by the cart and crossed toward her without haste. That too was worth noticing. He did not call out from a distance. He did not hurry. He did not pretend surprise. He came forward like a man who had already decided how he would meet whatever came. "Miss Marple," he said, with a short nod, "is there something I can help you with?" "I do hope I am not intruding," Miss Marple said, with the warm, apologetic air she had found useful in many circumstances where she had no intention of retreating. "I was on my way to see whether Mrs. Archer had any eggs this morning, and I thought I would take the longer way round past the farm. It is such a pleasant walk, yes, even at this time of year." Robert Langley received this explanation with the equanimity of a man who had heard many explanations in his time, and knew that receiving one was not the same as believing it. "We don't sell eggs from the farm," he said. "Mrs. Archer is at the cottage on Fenwick Road." "Of course she is. How foolish of me." Miss Marple looked around the yard with the cheerful interest of a visitor who had found more to admire than expected. What a well-kept yard, Mr. Langley. I always think a farmyard tells one a great deal about the people who manage it." Langley said he supposed it might, in the tone of a man who had never previously considered the matter, but was prepared to allow the possibility. "I believe you've been in the fields a good deal this week," Miss Marple continued with conversational ease. "This cold weather must require a great deal of extra attention." "Some," Langley said. "You were out Tuesday evening, I understand, checking the fields." The pause that followed was not long. To most people it might not have existed at all. But Miss Marple was listening for it, and it was there. "That's right," he said. "I go out most evenings when the weather's coming in. Habit more than necessity." "Of course. And the fog was particularly heavy on Tuesday evening, was it not? One would need a lantern." She glanced toward the cart with the most natural air in the world. "I noticed the hook there. A very sensible arrangement." Langley looked at the cart. Then he looked back at Miss Marple. His gaze altered slightly, not dramatically. Robert Langley was not a man for theatrical changes of expression, but in that moment he understood that the conversation was not quite what it had pretended to be, and he was deciding how best to conduct himself within it. Miss Marple gave him credit for not becoming flustered. "I used the lantern Tuesday evening, yes," he said. "Put it back on the hook when I came in." "Did you go as far as the boundary ditch?" Miss Marple asked. Her tone was mild. The question was not. "I checked the field nearest the lane," Langley said. "No farther." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "How very conscientious. Farming in November must require a diligence that people who merely live in villages, rather than work the land, tend to underestimate." "November has its demands," Langley said. She stayed a few minutes longer, speaking of frost, the condition of the lane, and the general question of drainage in the lower field. Drainage, it emerged, was a subject upon which Robert Langley had firm opinions and was willing to expand. This suited Miss Marple very well. A man speaking about land he knows is often less guarded than a man answering questions about where he has been. Langley spoke with the natural authority of possession and long practice. He knew where water lay after heavy rain, which patch by the lower boundary held damp longest, where the cartwheels sank if taken too early after frost, and which old ditch ought to have been cleared properly 10 years before, but never had been. Miss Marple listened with polite attention. She also observed him. He was a man fluent in his land. That was the phrase that came to her. The farm was not merely his livelihood. It was his memory. He knew it as a person knows a house lived in since childhood. Every awkward step, every draughty passage, every door that sticks in damp weather. Such a man did not need to go out into fog on a November evening because he was uncertain about the condition of a field. He would already know. If Robert Langley had gone out that Tuesday evening, he had gone for some other reason. At last Miss Marple took her leave with warm thanks and walked away along the lane toward Fenwick Road. The lantern hook remained fixed in her mind. So did the smear of soil on its upper curve. The soil had been dark and damp, the colour of the far end of Millbrook Meadow near the ditch and boundary stone, where the ground lay lower and wetter. It was not the lighter, drier earth nearer the lane, the field Robert Langley had claimed to have checked. A small thing. But then so many important things were small until properly placed. Miss Marple bought her eggs from Mrs. Archer, who was pleased to see her and offered tea. Miss Marple declined, explaining that she had a great deal to do at home. This was true. She had a great deal to think about. That was often much the same thing. She made her careful way back along the lane, the eggs wrapped safely in her basket. The winter sun had grown weaker, though it was not yet afternoon. The hedges glistened where damp still clung to the twigs, and somewhere beyond the fields came the distant, steady sound of work continuing on the farms. Farmers, Miss Marple reflected, generally knew every corner of their fields better than anyone else. A farmer like Robert Langley would know the difference between the earth near the lane and the earth beside the boundary ditch. And a man who knew his land that well had no reason to mistake which field he had stood in. Chapter 7. the folded map of the survey. Sunday passed in the manner that Sundays in St Mary Mead generally did. Church in the morning, a collective drawing in of breath at midday, and a long quiet afternoon during which the village withdrew into its own rooms, its own firesides, and its own carefully guarded thoughts. The lanes were empty except for the occasional dog and its reluctant owner. The smell of roasting meat drifted discreetly from kitchen windows. Curtains remained half-drawn against the grey light. By 3 o'clock, the whole village appeared to have folded itself away. Miss Marple attended morning service as usual. She sat in her customary pew toward the left of the nave, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, and listened to the sermon with the attentive expression of a person giving proper attention to the words. At the same time, beneath that outward attention, a second and equally serious line of thought was proceeding quite steadily. She was thinking about Daniel Pike. The young farmhand had found Mr. Selby. That was the extent of his official involvement, as far as Inspector Slack appeared concerned. He had discovered an injured man in a field, summoned help, answered a few questions, and returned, as far as the police were concerned, to the general category of useful witness. The village had absorbed his part in the affair under the comfortable heading of good fortune. It was good fortune that he had come across Mr. Selby when he did. Good fortune that the November cold had not been given more hours in which to do its work. Good fortune that Daniel Pike had known enough not to panic. He had been thanked in the informal, slightly embarrassed manner by which English villages thank people for doing the right thing. After that, he had been largely left alone. And yet, Miss Marple had learned to pay particular attention to those two words when they appeared together in her mind. Daniel Pike had not been going to the public house. He had been quiet in a way that, according to two separate village comments, differed from his ordinary character, and he worked for Robert Langley. Those three facts lay side by side in Miss Marple's mind. They might have no connection with one another. On the other hand, they might have exactly the connection she was beginning to suspect. She was in no immediate hurry. There was a particular kind of young man, and she'd known many over the course of a long life spent observing human nature, who could not be approached directly. A direct question produced a lowered gaze, a tightened mouth, and a retreat into monosyllables. Such young men were not necessarily dishonest. They were often merely loyal, awkward, or afraid of saying too much and making trouble where they had no wish to make it. The proper method was the oblique one. It required patience, a natural occasion, a subject that was not the subject, and if possible, the complete absence of any impression that one was approaching the matter at all. The right occasion presented itself on Monday afternoon. Miss Marple had gone out along Fenwick Road with no very definite destination beyond exercise and fresh air. The day was dull, the hedges damp, and the ground soft beneath her sensible shoes. She had gone perhaps halfway along the lane when she saw Daniel Pike outside the small cottage where he lodged. He was kneeling on the path, engaged in repairing a bicycle that had evidently suffered some indignity to its rear wheel. His tools were spread out beside him in a fan of increasing irritation, and his face wore the expression of a young man who had already spent 20 minutes upon a task that ought, by rights, to have taken 5. Miss Marple stopped. Bicycles in November are a considerable trial, she observed. Daniel looked up with the reflex courtesy of someone whose upbringing had included proper instruction in how to respond to elderly ladies, and agreed that they were. "Is it the tyre?" Miss Marple asked. "Or the wheel itself?" "The wheel, miss." He showed her. Dear Anne, she bent to look with genuine interest. Miss Marple had always believed that mechanical difficulties were far more interesting than mechanically minded people supposed. They had, after all, a logic to them. Something was bent, worn, missing, too tight, too loose, or in the wrong place. Human difficulties were seldom so obliging. They talked about the bicycle for several minutes. Daniel explained the trouble. Miss Marple listened. He picked up the wheel and turned it. She remarked that a small misalignment could produce a surprisingly large inconvenience. Daniel gave a faint grin and said that was certainly true enough. By then, A comfortable understanding had been established between them, without either of them needing to work very hard for it. When the conversation had reached a natural pause, Miss Marple said, in her mildly reflective way, "It must have been a very unpleasant thing for you, finding Mr. Selby as you did." Daniel set down the wrench. He didn't answer at once. He was perhaps 22 or 23, with an open, country-bred face of the sort that records feeling more plainly than its owner intends. What it recorded now was not merely discomfort. It was relief at being asked, mixed with uncertainty about how much the asking required him to say. "It was right enough," he said at last. "I imagine it stays with one," Miss Marple said sympathetically, "particularly when the circumstances are so unexpected." Daniel looked down at the wheel. "I knew he'd been going to look at the field." Miss Marple did not move. "He'd said so on the Monday," Daniel continued. "I was working the near hedge, and he came along the path. Stopped for a few minutes. We had a word. He seemed quite himself." "Yes, only—" Daniel paused, searching for the right phrase. "He seemed like a man who was working something out. You know how some people look as if they're not unfriendly, but they're somewhere else inside their own heads? He was like that." Miss Marple nodded. "I know exactly what you mean." "He had a folded paper in his hand," Daniel said. "The way people carry papers when they're going to look at them again in a moment. I didn't pay much attention at the time. I was busy. It was only afterward, when I knew what had happened, that I thought about it. A folded paper, carried in the hand of a careful man, a man already turning a problem toward its solution. It fitted. It fitted with Miss Finch's statement that Mr. Selby had been consulting old survey records. It fitted with Mrs. Selby's description of a man meticulous in his professional habits. It fitted, too, with the growing shape of the whole affair. Arthur Selby's professional instincts had not retired merely because Arthur Selby had. "Did he say what he was working out?" Miss Marple asked. "Not to me directly. He mentioned the whisper. Everyone had heard about it by then. He said, in that dry sort of way educated men have, that he supposed there were more prosaic explanations than the one Samuel Topp seemed inclined to favour. And then he walked on." Miss Marple allowed a little silence. Did Mr. Langley know that Mr. Selby had been to look at the field? She asked the question in precisely the same tone as all the others, gentle, interested, almost idle. Daniel picked up the wrench again. Yeah, he turned it once in his hands without using it. "Mr. Langley knew most things that happened on or near his land," he said at last. "It was the way he was." It was a careful answer, the sort of answer given by a loyal employee when the question touches his employer, and he has not yet decided whether loyalty requires silence or truth. Miss Marple did not press him. She spoke instead for a few minutes about the difficulty of keeping farm tools and machines in order in wet weather, wished him well with the bicycle, and continued her walk. She had gone perhaps 50 yards when Daniel called after her. "Miss Marple." She turned. He was still kneeling by the bicycle, but the wrench was on the ground now. So he looked at her with the expression of someone who had been holding a troublesome thing for several days, and had discovered that keeping hold of it had become harder than letting it go. "When I found him," Daniel said, "there was something in his inside coat pocket." Miss Marple walked back a little. "I didn't touch it," he continued quickly. "I was told when I was a lad that you don't move things from people who've been injured until the doctor comes. But I could see it. His coat had fallen open. It was a folded map, an ordnance survey or something like it." "The constable would have noted it," Miss Marple said. She made the observation so gently that it became a question. The constable looked at it, took it out, looked at it, and put it back. Daniel's face altered. It settled into something more solid than uncertainty. "But the bit that was folded out, the bit I saw before the constable put it away, it was a boundary survey. I know what those look like. Mr. Langley had one on his desk last month. I was in the office for a minute and saw it." "Was it the same map?" "I couldn't swear to that." "No, of course not. But it was the same sort. Old sheet, pencil marks on it. The kind land agents make. Mr. Selby would make marks like that. Miss Marple looked at him carefully. A boundary survey of this area specifically? Daniel nodded. Of this land. Langley land and the meadow beyond. The property along the eastern edge too. I recognised the shape of the fields. After that, he looked back at the bicycle wheel, as though he had said what he had intended to say, and now wished to return to a problem made of metal, spokes, and ordinary frustration. Miss Marple thanked him quietly and continued along the road. She walked more slowly than before. For Miss Marple on a reflective afternoon, this was very slow indeed. The picture was assembling itself with the gradual clarity of watercolour drying. Each layer settled into transparency, and in doing so revealed the one beneath. Arthur Selby had been a land agent of long experience. He had come to St. Mary Mead and had taken an interest, as men of his formation naturally did, in the land around him. Boundaries, rights of way, ditches, survey lines. The little discrepancies that lie unnoticed for years because people have grown accustomed to the practical arrangement, whether or not it is the legal one. And Arthur Selby had found something. He had found it in an old survey map, a folded map carried in his coat pocket. A map marked with the pencil notations of a man who understood what lines and measurements meant, and what those lines might mean to the people living on either side of them. The boundary between Robert Langley's farm and the adjacent property. A strip of cultivated land, perhaps. A stone that had shifted. A ditch that did not follow the line everyone believed it followed. An old survey that placed ownership differently from the arrangement the village had accepted for years. Such things happened. They happened more often than people like to admit. Boundaries in the countryside were sometimes less precise in life than they were on paper. A farmer worked the land as his father had worked it. A hedge thickened. A ditch was cleared in one place and not another. A stone leaned, sank, or disappeared. Custom smoothed over the discrepancy. Memory replaced measurement. Then, one day, someone unfolded a map, and the past acquired legal force. Miss Marple thought of Robert Langley. He had gone to a solicitor on Thursday. She was now quite certain why. She was also increasingly certain that Robert Langley had known on Tuesday evening that Arthur Selby had been examining the survey. Perhaps Daniel had mentioned seeing Mr. Selby on the path. Perhaps Langley had learned it in some other way, as farmers so often learn things that happened near their land. Perhaps Selby himself had approached him. Perhaps the meeting in the field had been arranged between them. Miss Marple did not yet know which. But she was very near to knowing what sort of meeting it had been. She thought again of the whisper in the fog, soft, clear, directed. Samuel Topp had heard it from the far end of the meadow near the ditch. It had called, or seemed to call, his name. It had drawn his attention to the field before dawn. A whisper in fog is not always meant to frighten. Sometimes it is meant to test. A man alone in a field may speak softly to judge how far a voice carries. He may call a word, a name, or a sound, and listen for the way the mist holds it. He may be preparing for a conversation in which he does not wish to raise his voice. It was a quiet method, almost a gentle one. Miss Marple could imagine it with painful clarity. A man anxious about a boundary, a man who wished to speak privately, a man hoping that two reasonable people might settle the matter without lawyers, officials, or village talk. He might not have intended harm at all. Indeed, Miss Marple increasingly suspected that he had not. She turned her steps toward home through the grey November afternoon. Arthur Selby, precise and methodical, had carried his folded survey map toward a meeting. Arranged, perhaps, or perhaps merely expected. He had carried with him the quiet confidence of a man who believes that facts, once properly set out, will be respected by other reasonable men. At the end of that walk, he had found something rather less reasonable. The map itself, Miss Marple thought, was likely still in his coat pocket at Driftwood Road. Waiting with the patient reliability of documents. People lie, people forget, people persuade themselves. Documents, if not tampered with, have the great advantage of not caring what anyone wishes them to say. Miss Marple looked toward the low sky above the hedges. It was nearly time to speak to Inspector Slack. Not yet. There was one more thing she wished to see for herself first. Chapter 8. The Boundary Stone. Near the drainage ditch. Tuesday brought a morning of such still and colourless perfection that it seemed almost a courtesy extended by the November weather to anyone who needed to cross open ground without the inconvenience of wind or rain. The sky was a uniform pale grey, not threatening, not bright, simply neutral. It was the kind of sky that withholds all opinion. The fields beyond the village lay quiet. The lane was empty when Miss Marple set out shortly after 10 o'clock, wearing her stout shoes and grey wool coat, with the firm and private intention of examining the boundary stone beside the drainage ditch at Millbrook Meadow. She had visited the field path twice now, but on neither occasion had she gone all the way to the ditch. There had been reasons for this, perfectly good reasons. Her purpose on those earlier visits had been to observe and to listen, not to examine. The drainage ditch was not the sort of destination one reached naturally in company without drawing attention to the particular nature of one's interest. This morning she was alone. The lane was empty, and she had no other errand. This suited her entirely. She crossed the stile with the care November stiles demanded, descended into the field, and walked along the path at a measured pace. The barley rows were still and colourless in the flat morning light. The hawthorn hedge at the turn of the path was bare now of everything except thorns and a few late-withered berries that the birds had not yet judged worth the effort. The patch of flattened barley that Miss Finch had noticed remained visible, though several days had softened its distinctness. At the outer edges the stalks had begun to lift again. At the centre they were still pressed down, darkened slightly by damp and weight. Miss Marple paused beside it. A person had waited there, or two people had stood there, or one person had stood there too long, shifting from foot to foot in the cold, watching the path and the hedge, listening for the sound of an approaching step or the glow of a lantern coming through fog. She walked on. The drainage ditch ran across the far end of the field at a slight diagonal, as old drainage ditches often do. It followed the natural fall of the land rather than the cleaner convenience of lines drawn upon paper, and it was not deep, perhaps 2 feet at its deepest point, with sloping earthen banks that would be perfectly manageable in daylight and dry weather, and much less so in darkness, fog and agitation. The soil at the bank was exactly what Miss Marple had expected. Fine, dark, damp. The same dark field soil she'd seen smeared on the lantern hook of Robert Langley's farm cart. It gave slightly beneath her shoes as she approached. The boundary stone stood at the eastern end of the ditch, where the meadow met the edge of the adjacent property. It was an old stone, set perhaps a century earlier, perhaps more. The unassuming rectangular sort one sees throughout the English countryside, marking agricultural limits with the quiet authority of long-established fact. It rose roughly to knee-height. Its upper surface had been worn smooth by weather. There was no inscription Miss Marple could make out. If there had once been markings, they had surrendered themselves to rain, frost, and a great many winters. She stood beside it and looked back across the field. The view was clear and complete. The full length of the barley rows lay before her, the hawthorn hedge at the turn of the path, the stile beyond, the darker line of village rooftops just visible above the hedges. On a clear morning, one could see everything that moved through the field from the moment it crossed the stile, and in fog, she thought, the reverse would be equally significant. A person standing here, near the boundary stone, would be invisible to someone entering from the stile. But a lantern moving across the far end of the field would be visible from here, a warm, isolated point of light in a world of whiteness. It would announce its bearer with each step. One could wait here, watch the light come nearer, know exactly when to speak. Miss Marple turned slowly, measuring the ground with her eyes. Samuel Topp had crossed the meadow before dawn earlier that week. He had heard a whisper calling his name, or what he believed to be his name, from the fog. He had been near this end of the field on his way to the farms beyond the eastern boundary. For a few moments he would have passed within easy speaking distance of anyone standing near the boundary stone. But the whisper had not truly been meant for Samuel Topp. Miss Marple was almost certain of that now. What she believed had happened was this. Robert Langley had come to the field in darkness before dawn, not to meet Samuel Topp, but to inspect the boundary stone. To see, for himself and without being observed, the precise position of the old stone in relation to the survey map he had seen, or had been told about, or perhaps both. He had come quietly, cautiously. A man does not always wish the world to know when he is frightened. He may have spoken softly to himself. He may even have called out a word or name experimentally, testing the way sound carried through fog across that low stretch of meadow. People do such things when they think they are alone. They test distance, they judge echoes, they rehearse conversations that they dread having later. Samuel Topp, passing through the field by the pure coincidence of habit, had heard the sound. And in the ambiguity of fog, darkness and solitude, he had heard his own name. That was not fanciful, it was human. Or one hears one's own name very easily in uncertain sounds when one is alone, and the world has shrunk to a few yards of white air. The whisper had not been for Samuel. It had been for no one at all. But it had become a story. That was the important point. It had travelled through St. Mary Mead in the comfortable, efficient manner of village stories. It had reached Arthur Selby. It had brought Millbrook Meadow into conversation. It had given shape, urgency, perhaps even legitimacy to his own private interest in the place. He already had the survey map. He was already thinking about the boundary. The whisper gave him a reason, or a pretext if he needed one, to take his lantern and his folded sheet and go into the meadow himself. Robert Langley had seen this coming, or guessed it. A man who fears that a portion of his land may not be his in the way he has always believed it does not wait calmly, while a retired land agent with old survey records inspects the boundary stone at leisure. He acts. Perhaps he persuades himself that action is only prudence. Perhaps he tells himself that all he wants is a private word before officials and solicitors become involved. He arranges to be there first, or he watches for the other man's arrival, or he meets him there, in the fog beside the ditch, where no one else need hear what is said. Miss Marple looked down at the earthen bank. The fall itself was plausible. That was one of the troubling things. It was not a dramatic ditch. 18 inches of slope perhaps at the relevant point, 2 feet at the deepest, but the bank was slick with damp, the ground was uneven. There were small hard irregularities near the base, stones, roots, old fragments of wood embedded in soil. One root in particular caught her attention, a dense knot of exposed wood near the waterline, pale and hard against the dark earth. A man slipping in the dark might strike his head there. An accident under such conditions was entirely possible, but accident did not exclude responsibility. An argument at the edge of a ditch could become an accident very quickly. A step taken too sharply, a hand put out in emphasis, a movement backward, a startled turn, one man too close to the bank, another too anxious, too insistent, too afraid. These things did not require murderous intention. Miss Marple had known many tragedies that owed far more to fear than wickedness. She stood for a long while beside the boundary stone and thought about fear. Not the theatrical kind, not the fear of melodrama, the quieter, more dangerous kind. The fear of losing something one has built one's life around. To Robert Langley, land was not property in the abstract. It was not simply acreage on a deed or a line on a survey sheet. It was the shape of his days, the work of his hands, his father's labour before him, his memory of seasons, his knowledge of where water gathered, where frost lingered, where barley came up well, where the soil turned dark after rain. People who live by land often feel land not as possession merely, but as part of themselves. Miss Marple had known such people. They did not become different people when threatened. They became concentrated versions of themselves. Reduced to the deepest and most anxious part of their nature, Robert Langley, she thought, was such a man. She did not believe he had set out to hurt Arthur Selby. She felt as certain of that as she was of anything in the case. He had gone there to persuade him, to delay him, to appeal to one practical man as another, to suggest that papers might be mistaken, that old surveys might be unclear, that nothing need be done hastily, that a man's whole livelihood should not be endangered by lines drawn long before either of them was born. Perhaps he had expected understanding. Perhaps he had met precision instead. Arthur Selby, Miss Marple suspected, would not have been cruel. But he would have been exact. An exactness to a frightened man may feel very like cruelty. The conversation had failed. Then it had become something else. With the ditch behind them, fog around them, and the lantern casting its small circle of certainty in the dark, something had gone wrong. Something Langley had not intended and could not undo. Afterwards, he had been left with choices, bad choices. He had left the lantern, or had not dared move it. He had gone back across the field. He had returned to the farm. He had put his own lantern back on the cart hook, carrying with it the dark soil of the boundary ditch. He had waited. That, perhaps, had been the worst of it. Waiting to learn whether Arthur Selby would die. Waiting to know whether the survey map would be found and understood. Waiting to see whether a thing born of fear would become something the law called by a harsher name. Miss Marple looked once more at the boundary stone. It stood solid and patient in the grey morning air, then entirely indifferent to the anxieties of men. It had been set there to mark a line. Yet the line it marked had perhaps been forgotten, misunderstood, shifted in memory or ignored, because daily life had found convenience elsewhere. The fog, she understood now, had been incidental. It had provided cover. It had provided occasion. It had given the village a story. But it had not created the danger. The danger had already existed in the folded survey map, in the position of the boundary stone, and in Robert Langley's fear that what he believed was his might be taken from him. The whisper in the field had been nothing supernatural, nothing ghostly, nothing more frightening in one sense than a man's voice in the dark, soft with caution. But human things, Miss Marple had always found, are quite frightening enough. She turned away from the boundary stone and walked back along the field path. The hawthorn hedge stood quiet at the turn. The flattened barley lay still beside the ditch. The stile waited at the edge of the lane. Nothing moved except a rook lifting heavily from the far field. As she crossed the stile and set her feet once more on the lane, Miss Marple felt nearly satisfied that she understood the matter. Nearly. There remained one task. It was time, she thought, to speak with Inspector Slack. Whether Inspector Slack would listen was, of course, an entirely separate question. Chapter 9. The Reason the Whisper Carried. Inspector Slack was not a man who welcomed interruptions to his working day with any great warmth. He was still less inclined to welcome interruptions that arrived in the form of elderly ladies from St. Mary Mead, bringing observations about matters he had already pronounced settled. He was a competent officer of the practical school. That is to say, he valued evidence that could be measured, testimony that could be verified, and conclusions that travelled by the shortest possible road from fact to report. He was not unintelligent, far from it. But his intelligence moved in straight lines, and he found the lateral, delicate, and often irritatingly accurate methods of Miss Marple faintly trying. It was not that she was wrong. That, in Inspector Slack's private opinion, was the most annoying part of it. He received her on Wednesday morning in his office at the constabulary, a small, orderly room smelling of paper, ink, and floor polish. Its window looked out upon the rear wall of the post office building, which offered little encouragement to imagination and none at all to sentiment. Inspector Slack rose when Miss Marple entered, because he was courteous. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk because he was efficient. Then he sat down again with the expression of a man who had several other matters requiring attention, and hoped that this particular matter might be disposed of without unnecessary wandering. Miss Marple settled herself in the offered chair. placed her bag neatly in her lap and looked at him with the mild, untroubled attention of someone who had come with something important to say, and intended to say it at precisely the proper pace. She did not begin with an accusation. Miss Marple rarely did. She began with a question. Has the survey map found in Mr. Selby's coat pocket been examined by anyone with professional knowledge of boundary surveys? Inspector Slack's expression altered very slightly. The map has been noted, he said. Noted? It appears to be an ordnance survey document of the kind a retired land agent might carry if he retained an interest in local property matters. In the context of an accidental fall in a field, it was not considered material evidence. Of course, Miss Marple said. I quite understand. Inspector Slack looked as if he rather doubted that she did. I wondered, Miss Marple continued gently, whether you might be willing to hear one or two observations that have come to my attention over the past week. Not because I wish to suggest that your initial assessment was incorrect in its fundamentals, but because there may be aspects of the matter which, done taken together, give a rather fuller account of what occurred that night. Inspector Slack had dealt with Miss Marple before. He had also, however reluctantly, acquired the knowledge that when Miss Marple said she had one or two observations, those observations generally required more time than expected and were more useful than he wished to admit. He took up his pen. Very well, he said. I'm listening. Miss Marple thanked him. She began with the survey map, not because it was where the sequence had begun, but because it was the fixed point around which all the other facts arranged themselves. A boundary stone, she thought, organised the landscape on either side of it. The map did much the same for this affair. Arthur Selby had been examining a survey document relating to the boundary between Robert Langley's farm and the adjacent property. Daniel Pike had seen Mr. Selby carrying such a folded paper on the Monday. Miss Finch had heard Mr. Selby refer to old survey records and a question he expected to have clarified within the week. The same map had been in his coat pocket when he was found unconscious beside the ditch. Miss Marple believed the map showed a discrepancy between the legal boundary and the working boundary, as Langley's farm had treated it in practice. If confirmed, she said quietly, such a discrepancy might cost Mr. Langley a strip of cultivated land. Inspector Slack made a note. His face did not change, but his pen moved more carefully now. Miss Marple continued. Robert Langley had visited a solicitor in the next town on Thursday, the day after Mr. Selby was found. That, she pointed out, was consistent with the behaviour of a man who had become aware that a legal question concerning his land was approaching resolution and wished to understand his position before that resolution arrived. It was also consistent with the behaviour of a man who had realised, during the 24 hours after Mr. Selby was discovered in the field, that the situation had acquired consequences he had not anticipated. Inspector Slack made another note. Miss Marple next described the lantern hook on the farm cart. She spoke of the faint smear of fine, dark soil along the curve of the iron bracket, soil matching the damp ground near the meadow ditch rather than the drier clay of the fields nearer Langley's lane. Then she described the flattened barley beside the ditch, not casual trampling, not the mark of a man pausing briefly to listen, a sustained compression, suggesting that someone had waited there for some time. After that, she spoke of Mrs. Selby's scarf caught on the Hawthorn thorns at the turn of the path, and Mrs. Selby's later admission that she had lost it on Tuesday evening in the lane, not in the field on Wednesday morning. The scarf, therefore, had been carried or worn into the field by someone else, someone who had stood close against the hedge, watching the far end of the meadow from a place of partial concealment. Inspector Slack was now taking notes steadily. He did not interrupt. Miss Marple went on. She described the boundary stone and the view from that end of the field. From beside the stone, one could see the full length of the barley rows, the hawthorn hedge, and the stile beyond. In clear weather, every movement through the field was visible. In fog, a person standing near the boundary stone would be hidden, while a lantern moving from the stile would show as a clear point of light. She spoke then of sound. of the way a soft voice might carry through fog across open ground, of Samuel Topp's account, not loud but clear. The whisper had not been, she suggested, a supernatural occurrence or a deliberate attempt to frighten Samuel Topp. It had been a human sound carried farther than expected, heard by the wrong man in the wrong moment, and interpreted naturally enough as his own name. Inspector Slack looked up. "Then you don't think the original whisper was meant for Topp?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I do not." "But you think another whisper was used later?" "I think the idea of the whisper became useful." She paused and folded her gloved hands over the clasp of her bag. "What I believe occurred," she said, "is this." Inspector Slack's pen waited. Robert Langley knew or discovered that Arthur Selby was in possession of a survey map directly concerning the boundary of his land. He understood that Mr. Selby intended to pursue the matter, and that if the map showed what Mr. Selby believed it showed, a professional assessment would follow, one Mr. Langley could not easily contest. She spoke very calmly, without hurry. Mr. Langley decided that a private conversation was his best chance to prevent or delay that outcome. He arranged or requested a meeting in the field in the early hours of Wednesday morning. The fog would ensure privacy. The place itself, the ditch, the boundary stone, the disputed line, would give the conversation its proper context. "And the whisper?" Inspector Slack asked. "The whisper was a practical device," Miss Marple said. "A way of guiding Mr. Selby through the fog toward the far end of the field, without calling out loudly enough to be heard from the lane." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "That implies Selby knew who was calling him." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I believe he did." "And followed willingly?" "I believe so. A private conversation between two practical men about a boundary question would have seemed perfectly natural to Mr. Selby. He had been a land agent for many years. He would have preferred, I think, to discuss the matter directly before it became formal." Inspector Slack was silent for a moment. Miss Marple continued. "Mr. Selby had gone to the field expecting a professional conversation. Perhaps a difficult one, but still a conversation. Langley had hoped to persuade him to delay his assessment, reconsider the discrepancy, or find some practical accommodation that would protect Langley's working land while acknowledging the legal position. But Arthur Selby, Miss Marple suspected, had refused. Not unkindly. She did not think him an unkind man, but firmly. And firmness in professional matters is often quite immovable. "Mr. Selby would have been exact," she said. "I think exactness can seem very hard to a frightened man." Inspector Slack's face twitched slightly, as if he wished to object to the phrasing and could not find quite the right grounds. The conversation became heated, Miss Marple said. Two men standing at the edge of a drainage ditch in darkness and fog, one frightened, the other unyielding, need very little more to produce an outcome neither intended. "You think Langley pushed him?" "I do not believe he pushed him deliberately." Inspector Slack looked at her sharply. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that there was some instinctive physical movement, a step forward, a hand put out in urgency or emphasis, the ordinary gestural language of strong feeling. In a sitting room it would have meant nothing. At the edge of a ditch in darkness it was dangerous. Arthur Selby had lost his footing. He had fallen down the bank and struck his head against the exposed root near the base of the ditch. The injury had been serious, but not fatal. Robert Langley, terrified by what had happened, had left him there. Miss Marple did not soften the fact, but neither did she distort the man. "Mr. Langley is not, I think, a cruel person," she said, "nor a calculating one in the ordinary sense. He acted from fear, and then, finding himself in a dark field beside the consequences of that fear, he did not do what a better man, or even perhaps the same man in calmer circumstances, might have done. He left," Inspector Slack said. "Yes. That is a serious matter. Very serious. Even if he believed Selby would be found. Perhaps especially then," Miss Marple said quietly. "Because people are very good at telling themselves that the thing they want to be true is already true enough." Inspector Slack was silent. The office seemed very still. Miss Marple could hear faint movement somewhere beyond the door, then and the distant sound of a typewriter from another room. On the desk between them lay Inspector Slack's notes, the official shape of a truth that had begun as a whisper in a foggy field. At last he said, "The map. If it shows what you believe it shows, that gives us the reason for the meeting." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and the reason for leaving. And Pike's testimony about the map. Consistent with everything else." Inspector Slack looked down at his notes. He had the expression of a man who had been led by a route he would not have chosen to a destination he was now obliged to acknowledge. "Langley will need to be spoken with," he said. "I think he will not be very difficult to speak with," Miss Marple said gently. "He has been carrying this since Wednesday. That is a considerable weight for a man who is not at his foundation. Dishonest." Inspector Slack gave her a look that suggested he found this kind of psychological observation irritating, imprecise, and hard to dispute. Miss Marple had always considered that his most encouraging expression. "He did not act well," she added, "but I do not think he is pleased with himself for it." Inspector Slack closed his notebook. "I shall look into the matter." "Thank you, Inspector." He thanked her for coming, rather stiffly, and Miss Marple rose, collected her bag, and left the office with the quiet relief of someone who had said the necessary thing to the necessary person. Outside, the November morning was cold and clear. A thin brightness lay over the village, the nearest November could manage to generosity. Miss Marple walked home at a comfortable pace. She thought of Arthur Selby recovering in the house on Driftwood Road, of Mrs. Selby composed and watchful, of Robert Langley sitting with his solicitor and his fear, of the boundary stone standing patient and unchanged in the empty field, of the folded survey map, now no longer a mere object in a coat pocket, but the key to everything. Small things, Miss Marple thought. The usual small things. A whisper, a scarf, a handkerchief, a smear of soil, a folded map. They were always small things in the beginning, and they were never small at all once one had learned how to look. Chapter 10. Knitting by the Parlour Hearth. The resolution of the matter came about in the quiet, undramatic way that resolutions in small English villages generally do. That is to say, it involved a series of conversations rather than one grand confrontation, and those conversations were conducted with the decent restraint of people who understood that the village would continue after the matter was settled. In a place like St. Mary Mead, that was important. The manner of settlement was nearly as significant as the settlement itself. Inspector Slack spoke with Robert Langley on Wednesday afternoon. Miss Marple was not present and did not expect to be. She had given the inspector what he required. The formal procedures now belonged to formal institutions, and Miss Marple had never felt any need to stand in the centre of a room when a corner would do perfectly well. She heard about the conversation later, as she heard about most things, through the ordinary channels of village information, which required neither effort nor inquiry. On this occasion, those channels were supplemented by a brief and characteristically composed account from Mrs. Selby, who came to call on Friday morning and remained rather longer than either of them had expected. Langley, it appeared, had not been difficult to speak with. He had received Inspector Slack with the expression of a man who had been waiting for a particular knock at the door for several days, and was almost relieved when it came. He confirmed, in a plain and unembroidered manner, the substance of what Miss Marple had laid before the inspector. The meeting in the field, the conversation about the survey, Selby's refusal to delay his assessment, the heated exchange at the edge of the ditch, the fall, and Langley's own departure from the field in the frightened, confused minutes that followed. He said he had told himself Mr. Selby would be found. The fields were crossed every morning. Someone would come. No great time would pass. This was the story he had held to during the days between Wednesday morning and Wednesday afternoon. From the manner of his telling it, it was clear he had not found it a comfortable story to live with. Inspector Slack took his statement, and the matter passed to the appropriate authorities. The final description was more accurate than the original one. Mr. Selby's fall had not been deliberate violence, but neither had it been a simple accident. It had resulted from a physical altercation conducted with reckless disregard for the safety of another person. That placed it in a category rather different from the tidy explanation the village had first accepted. Arthur Selby himself confirmed the account several days later, and it was when he had recovered sufficiently to speak clearly. He was, as Mrs. Selby had always insisted he would be, entirely precise. He confirmed the arranged meeting, the disagreement over the survey, the moment at the ditch bank, and, with the objectivity of a professional man describing professional matters, the likely legal consequences for Langley's land if the survey were formally assessed. When asked whether he wished the matter pursued to its fullest extent, he replied that he would leave that question to those better equipped to judge it. This was either modesty or exhaustion. Those who knew him best suspected it was mostly the latter. The boundary question itself was eventually referred to a proper survey. Some weeks later, it was settled through a negotiated arrangement between Langley and the owner of the adjacent property. The outcome cost Langley a modest but not ruinous portion of his eastern field margin. No one was enthusiastic, everyone was relieved. That, in village matters involving land, was often the best available ending. Langley was not prosecuted in the end, which was the outcome much of the village had quietly expected once Mr. Selby survived and confirmed the circumstances. There were those who considered this too lenient and said so, with the comfortable directness of people airing strong opinions over counters, gates, and tea trays. Others thought it precisely right and said so just as firmly. When Mrs. Price at the post office asked Miss Marple for her view, Miss Marple said only that the law had done what it was designed to do, and that what remained was between Mr. Langley and his conscience. Mrs. Price had looked a little disappointed by this answer. Miss Marple, however, had always found conscience a far more demanding tribunal than many people supposed. Daniel Pike returned to the public house on the Friday of the week Langley gave his statement. Evidently, he had decided that the weight he had been carrying was now sufficiently distributed among those whose responsibility it properly was. His fellow workers received his return with the understated warmth of working men who do not make ceremonies of such things, but are genuinely pleased when a matter that troubled them has been set right enough to continue living with. Miss Marple, hearing of it, was quietly glad. Miss Clara Finch passed her on the lane one morning the following week, and stopped to say that she had heard the outline of what had occurred. "I find," Miss Finch said with a faintly self-conscious smile, "that on reflection I am rather more interested in the survey question than in the dramatic elements of the case. I suppose that says something about the limits of my imagination." "I think," Miss Marple said, "that it says something very good about your priorities." Miss Finch smiled with the slight reserve of a woman not accustomed to receiving compliments, and not entirely certain what to do with them. They parted on very warm terms. Mrs. Selby's Friday visit included a small pot of honey from a neighbour's bees, and the information that Arthur was up and about. He had returned to his papers, though he was managing them from an armchair rather than a desk on Dr. Haydock's orders. Mrs. Selby appeared to regard this as a satisfactory compromise between the claims of recovery and the claims of professional habit. "He asked me to convey his thanks," she said. "Did he specify what for?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "No," Mrs. Selby said, which is probably characteristic. Miss Marple smiled. "I am very glad he is recovering well. I hope the bramble jelly was acceptable." "It was excellent." They had tea and spoke of the garden, the weather, and the relative merits of various approaches to winter mulching. Mrs. Selby, it emerged, had decided and well-informed opinions on the subject, which Miss Marple found genuinely interesting. It was on the following Tuesday evening, some 10 days after the affair had begun to find its resolution, that Dolly Bantry came to call, Mrs. Dorothy Bantry was an old and valued friend of many years, vigorous, good-natured, and possessed of a commanding presence that made even an entrance into a parlour seem slightly like the opening of an event. She had always treated the minor complications of village life with brisk and affectionate irreverence. As someone who had seen enough of the world to maintain perspective on its dramas without losing interest in them, she arrived at Dana Mead at 7 o'clock, carrying a tin of shortbread she had made that afternoon, and declaring cheerfully that she had been hearing the most extraordinary things and wished them explained. Miss Marple was in her parlour with her knitting, the grey wool cardigan that had progressed at a row or two per evening over the past fortnight, and she received Dolly with the warmth of someone for whom an old friend's company on a November evening is precisely the right kind of company. The fire was well established. The curtains were drawn against the dark. The room had that quality of domestic comfort most clearly felt in late autumn, when the world outside has done its best to be inhospitable, and the interior answers with lamplight tea and the small security of familiar chairs. Dolly settled herself in the second chair, helped herself to her own shortbread, and proceeded to deliver, with considerable relish, and only moderate accuracy, the version of events that had circulated through the village. Like most accounts assembled from multiple sources and filtered through a vigorous interpolating intelligence, it was largely correct in outline and cheerfully embellished in detail. Miss Marple listened with the attentive smile of someone following a piece of music she knows well, and enjoying even the performer's departures from the original, when Dolly reached the end and declared that the whisper in the fields had been terribly mysterious. Exactly the sort of thing one read in the kind of novel one did not mention in polite company, but nevertheless found entirely gripping. Miss Marple smiled gently and set down her knitting. "My dear," she said, "the countryside is rarely mysterious by itself." Dolly looked at her expectantly. Miss Marple rested her hands lightly upon the needles. "It is only that people sometimes believe their worries will disappear if spoken softly." Dolly considered this. "Robert Langley did not set out to create a mystery," Miss Marple continued. "He set out to protect something he was afraid of losing. The fog, the whisper, the dark field. Those were not the story. They were simply the circumstances in which the story happened to take place." "And the whisper itself?" Dolly asked. "Samuel Topp's whisper?" "A man's voice carrying farther than he expected through fog," Miss Marple said. "Nothing more, and yet, in its way, very important. That small accident of sound brought the whole matter to light. If Samuel Topp had not crossed that field at that particular hour," she went on, "and if Arthur Selby had not heard the story, and if Arthur Selby had not been precisely the sort of man who carries a survey map in his pocket, and feels professionally obliged to look at things for himself, the boundary question might have remained unresolved for another generation. So the whisper was useful," Dolly said, with the satisfied air of someone who had found a narrative shape pleasing to her. "Useful and entirely accidental," Miss Marple agreed, "which is, I have always found, how most important things arrive." She picked up her knitting again and counted her stitches with the quiet concentration of long practice. Dolly poured them each another cup of tea from the pot on the small table between them. The fire settled lower in the grate with the soft, companionable sound fires make when they are at their most comfortable. Outside, mist had begun to gather once more across the barley fields. It drifted in its unhurried way from the direction of Millbrook Meadow, thickening as the night deepened, as it had done before and would continue to do on clear, cold November evenings for as long as the village stood and the fields lay open beneath the autumn sky. The parlour was warm, the knitting progressed by another steady row, and the quiet life of St. Mary Mead continued, patient, watchful, and entirely sufficient,